great pleasure to be able to welcome you to tonight's screening of the fascinating documentary film titled Khata, Poison or Purity. The film explores the paradoxical role of sacred Tibetan ceremonial scarves, known in Tibetan as Khata, which are offered to signal purity of intention, auspiciousness, and harmonious relationships, among other positive meanings, but are also leading to environmental pollution and widespread ecological harm. We are very fortunate to be joined this evening by the film's director, Huatse Gyal, who in addition to being a filmmaker is an assistant professor of anthropology at Rice University. So after the screening, which will run about 45 minutes, Huatse and I will discuss the film. So without further delay, please sit back and relax and enjoy Khata, Purity or Pollution. Thanks. Dr. Gyal earned his PhD in anthropology at the University of Michigan and is currently assistant professor of anthropology at Rice University. And before coming to Rice, Dr. Gyal served as assistant professor of anthropology and museum studies at Sichuan University in southwest China. Dr. Gyal's research explores the interdependent relationships between land, language, and community, with a focus on state environmentalism and climate change, and indigenous environmental and political movements in a global context. Dr. Gyal is the author of numerous articles, a co-editor of the 2015 volume titled Resettlement Among Tibetan Nomads in China, and co-editor of the 2024 special issue of the journal Yeshe, titled Translating Across the Bardo, Centering the Richness of Tibetan Language in Tibetan Studies. Dr. Gyal's current project is a book entitled, I hope it's still titled this, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, Restoring Indigenous Relations of Land, Rangeland Fencing, Resettlement, and the Resilience of Tibetan Pastoralists. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Huatse Gyal.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
So I just wanted to start us off with maybe a little bit of background, if you wouldn't mind just sharing with us how you came to this project and how your interest in Khata began, and how it, segued into a film project.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here tonight. And this is really wonderful to be in the presence of scholars that I deeply admire, James and John and others. And my deepest gratitude to the center for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity. And thank you all for coming tonight. I always like to say that we get to experience this tonight only once in our life, and thinking about it, it's like, oh, it's kind of really precious, right, to be in this space. And I'm deeply grateful. To answer your question, when I was doing research as an ethnographer in eastern part of Tibet, in the Tibetan regions and today's Sichuan province, I witnessed this. There's when it comes to winter, when there's not much grass. That is, winter, the transition from winter to spring is a very hard, difficult time in the Tibetan nomadic areas. And there's not much that grass, and people and animals are waiting for the new grass to grow. And during that time, some of the most experienced herders, there's a Tibetan term, tsorjong. Tso is like maybe grazing, but jong is nurturing. And there are herders who know how to graze, but then there are herders who know how to nurture the animals. It's a kind of different level. Even the ones who know how to nurture the animals during very difficult seasons, they don't know what to do when the animals die from eating discarded kata, prayer flags that are hanging on the maybe sacred tree or mountains. and those arrows that you've seen as part of the ritual. And a lot of animals die from eating plastic kata and other prayer flags, a set of objects. I happen to just focus on kata. And so that was a time I started collecting images of like animals dying, breathing in pain, and I have certain videos which I didn't include. And so that was a time when I thought like, oh, maybe like I can make a film about this, or kind of tracing the source of this. And then why a film was the long story, but I was in anthropology. There's a kind of cliche or something like, there's this saying that the main one of the main tasks of anthropology is to make the strange familiar and familiar strange. And for someone like me, who was born, raised in the Tibetan area, Tibetan region, and then end up doing my dissertation work in Tibet, there's always this idea like, oh, maybe I need to find an object in my cultural context and something so familiar, but maybe I can present in a different way. And then Khata was like, oh, like a lot of people, when I was even working on this film, people asking like, oh, what are you doing these days? And I'm trying to make a film documentary from Khata. People are like, are you an idiot? Like everybody knows Khata, and you don't know what Khata is, so why do you need to make a film? But then I finished the film, and then of course, in the process, I discovered a lot of things that tracing the raw material to petroleum. I was like, wow, that's quite a new discovery. And then also discovered that the kata is produced in this predominantly Chinese town in the outskirts of Chengdu City. It's like, oh, that's another kind of discovery. Yeah, so that's how I kind of got into this project. And yeah, maybe short kind of, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Something that you focus on in the film that you just mentioned is this symbiotic relationship between Tibetans and Chinese around kata production and manufacture and selling, actually.
Yes.
And so one opinion of one of the interviewees was that it's an important item of exchange in forming close relationships between Chinese and Tibetans. Is that something that you observed across the board? Was that a unique perspective of that one individual, or what's your perspective on that opinion?
Thank you so much. That one, he is also the CEO of one of the factories. And I was talking earlier on that in a film like this, it's very easy to demonize the factories, portray them as like this factories, these are the evil kind of people producing the pollution. But as an ethnographer, anthropologist, ethnographer, you work with people and you interview them. You also have an ethical commitment to portray them in a way, like a human way, positive way, give kind of full humanity. So it was a selective process in there, as a CEO of this Khata factory, there's some things in there that he sees as positive. So for me, that was a selective, like, oh, that is important. And the other part is, there is this kind of larger narrative that all Tibetans should be grateful for the Chinese state development because we brought development, economic development, and prosperity. But then there is the very particular context where actually an entire Chinese township relies on the Tibetan cultural products as the source of income. And in one of my interviews, one of the families family members said, I'm very grateful for Tibetan culture for feeding our family for 3 generations. Right? So for me, like as an anthropologist, ethnographer, I think those individual voices of this kind of, even when it comes to economy, this kind of interdependence, this connection, all that, I think that is very important because otherwise you portray certain people as just rely on the development, otherwise they would not have a good life. And so you kind of complicate that narrative and not reverse, but provide an alternative. And regarding whether that view of the Khata has created this bond between the Tibetan and Chinese, whether that is shared among all Tibetans is hard to say. But that's his opinion, and I respected that. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, one of the, for me, one of the themes that kind of emerged as a point of interest is the discourse around wool.
Yes.
So wool as an alternative to polyester, and wool as having a kind of deep roots in Tibetan culture, and this concept of the mutak,
Yes, yes.
which is really a kind of pre-Buddhist conception of the cord, of a kind of cord stretching between the divine realm and the human realm. And I was just wondering about, there's the push toward using wool, and that kind of discourse around the cultural importance for Tibetans of wool.
Yes.
Is that something that is sort of circulating more broadly among Tibetans, or is that something that particular manufacturer was trying to promote? And the idea, the relationship between the katak and the mutak is a very interesting one for me, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that relationship, or about the history of that relationship that you could share with us.
Yes. Yes, and also a little complicated. Yes, in the sense that that manufacturing, that center, it makes quite a compelling case. Quite a compelling case that there is kind of pre-Buddhism, indigenous cultural practice of giving sheep bulls to people departing, and also as a gift when they're coming back, and so a lot of in a way kind of tracing the origin of Khata to sheep bull. It's quite compelling, makes it very compelling. And as a market to it, it also does something quite powerful. And when it comes to business, I think this particular business is relatively doing well. Not as good as the big like mass production. They make millions of dollars, but relatively doing well. But when it comes to the history, of course, then the other historians say, no, we cannot conflate Khata to Mata, and that there are other histories, and there's not a real kind of evidence you can find if you read all this text and dating back to 14th century, 13th century. You don't really see this like Khata and Mata, or even Khata, Shipu as Khata used interchangeably. So the historians like Garmadillo would contest that, would disagree. But in general, for me, the prominence of Shipu as a source of fortune and blessing, and then the Khata is as that, it's quite a compelling argument. But scholarly, it's arguable. Yeah. Yes.
That's very interesting. So that conception of that kind of move toward connecting katak with the value placed on sheep wool, is that something that's become more influential, would you say, as a result of these initiatives? Or?
I think so. Yes. Sheep wool indeed is the embodiment of a notion of fortune, and Khata is being viewed as such. And then when I was making this film, I was a little concerned that I didn't make this film for that center. In a way, I was a little concerned in the sense that this may work as an advertisement for that. And so that's the last point that made by a very prominent Tibetan historian who studied Tibetan texts, old texts, and he basically said it's not about replacing the plastic Khata with sheep wool, but finding an alternative. And that I like that because that is really the message in a way that the younger generation, different cultural context, and people in India use Khata, Nepal use Khata, Sherpa communities and others, based on whatever they think is a fitting material for Khata. I think I like that open possibility. Yeah? And a friend of mine and a group of NGOs screened Khata the film in Lata, and then they told. This was a really, I was very moved to hear that. They said after they watched the film, they said, "Oh, we're not going to use Khata, but we have an idea. We can make Khata out of something else." So for me, I like that to be the message. And I mean, not promoting Shipu. There's a good reason to promote Shipu because that might even bring some economic benefits and revenue for the nomadic herders, but that could lead to some other pollutions as well. So it's not as easy. Yeah. So in that sense, I like that open possibility where you have the interaction with the audience, and depending on the cultural context from where they're from, and if they think something else is better. And the other thing is, of course, using less. And I really like what I had never thought the Tibetan term gomchoksam, like the three jewels. We always say, like, even as a swear, you say gomchoksam. As like three jewels, and I had never thought of the term of until this Tibetan professor Yemtje, again Yemtje from Southwest Minsk University, a very prominent Tibetan historian. He says gomcho means gwen means rare, cho means treasure. So the word itself is like it's rare, so it's treasure. And then if it violates that, if it's used ubiquitously everywhere, then it's no longer a treasure. So it's in a way that's like I like those moments where people are theorizing, drawing on Tibetan concepts that people just haven't taken for granted. It's a word, but actually it's a phrase in a way. Like it's a because of something, and it's a word. Yeah, that's like gomcho. Yeah. So, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Something you just raised, this and was, of course, part of the film, is just how widespread the use of kata actually are across all manner of cultures throughout the entire Himalayan range. And even in Mongolia, every region basically touched by Tibetan culture has picked up the use of kata. And what was so striking for me is how many different contexts, like and this idea of the rarity of it, and the preciousness of it, yet the mundaneness of how it's become in a way, using them in bars, karaoke bars, and all these kind of situations. And I'm just wondering, is it still the case that monasteries are the main consumers of kata at this point? Would you say that?
It's hard to say that. It's very hard. And one of the reasons why I say it's hard, when I went to one of the factories, and they were labeled as names of different work units in Lhasa, Tibetan work units. Like education department, tourism department. I was like, why do you have these labels on the machines? And they said, oh, we just make kata for this different work units. And how they're using it, they said, two contexts. One is that when the higher-ups from the central government visit, inspect works in Lhasa, the Tibetans and non-Tibetans would line up and offer kata to them, so they make them feel that they're as important as lamas, and so that it's widely used in that context. So different work units in Lhasa prepare thousands of katas in advance. And the work inspection happens regularly, so you need them all the time. And another one is, of course, that tourism is a big one, where when a lot of people from the mainland, lowland areas come visit Lhasa and places, and And this is the world of business, and they make them kata, and offer kata to the tourists, and make them feel that again, as if they're as important as the Buddhist lamas and teachers, and so in that context, it's used. Right? So in that sense, from there, I also try to kind of think of this as a kind of research project. It has been a side project for a long time, not my primary research, and I've been reading some literatures on this, and there's some scholars, group of scholars, and have been might categorize this as like Buddhist waste or something like that, and the more I learn about the kata and I learn about its raw material and tracing the raw material to a type of product from petroleum. So if we have to categorize this as a type of waste, it's just saying that as a Buddhist waste is sometimes quite misleading, and because what we're dealing with is more of a petrochemical waste, and it's also a kind of capitalist waste, and so sometimes by categorizing it as a Buddhist waste, you place the blame on the monasteries and communities. It's not that they're not complicit, but you're missing the larger picture, right? And so, in the main primary work of land restoration in eastern part of Tibet, and there's this kind of a lot of narratives of blaming the local people. There's land degradation. It's because it's overgrazing. We can blame the local population. And then there's a lot of kata waste and this, and it's Buddhist waste. And sometimes I think we have to be very careful with this categories, the way we categorize this, and sometimes, especially when it comes to something like religion, it's Buddhism or Islam or any other religion. For a lot of people, it's near to their heart, and having a category like Buddhist waste is not the most sensitive or thoughtful thing to say. And so in that sense, yeah, I've been thinking of this in if we have to think about this as a part of a global material production process, and so that's something that I've been thinking about. Yeah.
Thank you, Huatse. That's a really very well-considered response and line of thinking that I appreciate. So the film seems to have the great potential to bring an awareness among consumers of the possible dangers. But what you're saying reminds me a bit of this argument around placing the onus solely on consumers.
Yes.
Like with recycling, for example, where we do our part to recycle, but how much pressure is actually being placed on corporations or the state to step in and, in fact, change, bring about radical change in the materials that are being used and the way they're being distributed. So I'm wondering, and I take your point of kind of moving away from blaming the consumers for this, and do you think the film, and has it maybe already, had a positive reception among actors who can bring about change on a larger level, on a larger scale, beyond the scale of local consumption?
That's an amazing question, and I wish I could say yes, but it's hard. I was talking with one of my friends who's also a filmmaker, and he said, sometimes you make these films, and is this gonna make a change? Hard to say. And then in maybe 200 years, 300 years, when people look back, did we say anything? We did say something. Right? So that's the kind of, humble. At least we didn't stay quiet, and we raised the issue. And but I think the critique, looking, as you said, looking at this, the kata within the context of the waste, tracing the waste to petroleum. I think that is a very powerful. It's a small example, but it opens a whole new world. And when I was filming in the Khata factories, and I look at one of this kind of a bundle of this raw material, and I look at the company name, and it's they imported it from one of the largest petrochemical companies in China. And so for me, that is the mass production of Khata, the rise of that also coincided with the rise of petrochemical companies in China. Right? So it's in a way like we need to look at this in that kind of broader picture, and having more awareness of that, I think there's a possibility to make some changes on a broader level. And that being said, that of course, social behavioral changes among consumers would definitely, would never kind of overlook that. But in the context of Tibet, when it comes to religion, the category of Buddhist waste, it's a little kind of, when actually kata is used in so many contexts. Some you cannot even say it's a Buddhist context, and the others of course they can buy less and consume less and all of that, but they're not the main culprits or like main. Yes. When it comes to pollution, yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I mean, one of the things that has struck me just traveling throughout the Himalayan regions is precisely that idea that the kata is offered as a tourist, as a traveler, often, and everywhere from Bhutan to Ladakh, right? And throughout the Kathmandu Valley and all around Nepal, you experience people giving katas or social pressure to give katas, and on special days or on special occasions, and how very secular many of these contexts are, actually well beyond Buddhist settings, business settings, settings where relationships are important. Yeah. I taught English for a while in Kangding, in a place in Sichuan province, and there kataks were offered as a teacher constantly. Yes. So, and student-teacher relations are really expressed very nicely in terms of giving and receiving katak. So that's a really great point, that it really isn't just a Buddhist issue, and really relegating it to the Buddhist zone is not quite appropriate or accurate. The larger petroleum industry is a very interesting link, and then we get into global dynamics that propel katak production, and that's a fascinating link. So you mentioned that you've been exploring this to some extent. Is this you've mentioned a paper that you're writing? Would you mind just sharing a little bit about what your conception of this? I mean, is it intended to kind of connect with the film, or give some background to the film, or maybe move away into another domain?
I think I have a finished draft of a paper, not published yet, and where it's in a way in the paper, it's easier to conceptualize some of these things. Right? It's easier than the film. So the content of that is not necessarily the film per se, but more of the argument of when you focus on something like kata, something so small, and then you explore its connections to all these different sources, it opens up this whole new world. And another thing is there's this I try to come up with a term that does not always demonize one thing, like a corporation's bad, a state bad, and I mean sometimes they're bad, And then the term I've come up with is kind of not the best, but I say there's a collective addiction to convenience. And I see that in Khata as well. It's so convenient and it's so easy and it's just like so cheap. And when you open up this, situating this in the larger context of petroculture, and that very much shapes our lives today. Oh, but there's a saying in Tibetan that goes like, maybe you did not eat the stolen goat's meat, but I'm sure you enjoy the soup. So I see a situation where most of us are probably not eating the stolen goat's meat, but many of us are enjoying the soup. Right? So that is the kind of analytical framework I want to bring to the paper that I'm thinking of a book project thanks to people like you and you. I've been invited. I've had the honor of presenting this at maybe 15 some different universities, and I've given so many wonderful feedback. I was like, oh, this, have you thought about that? Have you thought about this? I was like, no, I'll take notes. And so I have a lot of material, so potentially, maybe enough material for an article or something, or book or something like that.
We really look forward to seeing that and reading that. Very exciting.
And another saying in Tibetan say and if they don't share things you have never done, you haven't done.
Too late. Well, you have a draft at least at this point. So
I've shared draft with my dear colleague James, so it's in your mailbox.
It's a wonderful paper already, so I look forward to seeing it published. Just about filmmaking, I wanted to ask you a few questions about, we're running a little bit short of time, but I'm really struck by the opening scenes where you're really dwelling on the materiality of the Khata production and line and these kinds of scenes. And it I don't know, it reminded me of there's a film Leviathan that came out years ago, and I think it was 2012, that explored in a similar vein, but on a ship, and the workings of a ship. And I was wondering if that was coming out of this ethnographic film lab at Harvard. And I was wondering if you're intentionally exploring the materiality of Khata manufacture in those opening scenes and throughout, and what you were trying to achieve through those very evocative long shots of the spinning of these polyester threads. It's fascinating.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful question. I was not exactly, not thinking of that particular film, or I'm a big fan of the ethnographic lab at Harvard. We have something similar at Rice Anthropology Department. And so for me, it goes back to this making strange familiar and the familiar strange. So for the audience, because when we think about Khata, it evokes kind of this something as kind of a blessing, sincerity, faith, beauty, and all that. And so what kind of images I can bring to kind of not mess up, but kind of create, something that people would never think. So that I was thinking about that. And another thing, it's also quite misleading, to be honest, after I finished. One of the things that made me really sad, other than a lot of animals died from eating plastic Khata, and fish dying, and all that other, the one moment that made me really sad is the working conditions in these factories. And neither the film nor text forms of knowledge production can capture the smell. It's unbearable. So there, we were filming for for a day, maybe 9 a.m. to maybe 3 p.m. And at the end of the day, I had a headache. My other colleague was like, "Oh, I don't feel like to eat food." It was unbearable. It was unbearable in the factories, and quite a number of people working there, like every day. And so that was very hard. That was the smell. It's like plastic burning, maybe 2 times worse. And for me, again goes back to this kind of anthropology or ethnography, this ethical commitment to all the people that you interact with. And for me, that is a really kind of a difficult job, and also it's like a job that would not evoke a sense of like richness or wonder or beauty. But maybe I thought like maybe through filmmaking I can do that. I can say like this is like looks kind of looks nice in a way, right? So so things like that in the filmmaking that is like can be very misleading, but I think all kind of scholarly work is also extremely selective, right? And so it's, so in that sense, for me, one is making the strange familiar and strange familiar strange, and the other part is to maybe kind of give kind of a poetic, some kind of like a beauty to this everyday labor, and then the other part, I see it on the bigger kind of economic domination by one particular town, all of that. But at the same time, I also want the Tibetans who watch this film to have that kind of humanity for people in working in these conditions as well. So I think that's the other thing. Yeah. And ethnographic writing, you can sometimes do things like that. Things that would never be portrayed as art or poetic or as But in the filmmaking, it's like, oh, you focus on that, and there's a rhythm to it. Everything's perfect. Yeah, but then in the film, everything's not perfect. Yeah, so those are just like things you can like play. Experiment. That's the like academic experiment.
Well, it was really evocative, really very effective, that juxtaposition that you created there. Really quite strong. And I mean, speaking of the difficulty of the odor and these kinds of difficulties, were there any other kinds of challenges that you faced while making this film that sort of worked to make the strange familiar or the familiar strange in any kind of behind the camera?
Some challenges, and I took some ethnographic film classes before this, and I also had some knowledge of filmmaking, taking classes from here and there, and there's some like conventional rules of filmmaking. I'm sure many of you are thinking or maybe aware that like people don't like interviews. People don't like this kind of don't say it, show it. There's the don't talk. And instead of saying it, just show it like through the film. So that's showing is more kind of superior. And then interviews like, oh, you have maybe for the film critiques would write things. Oh, you have a lot of talking heads and like people talking. People don't like. So for me, when I was focused on the film, I was like, oh, sometimes you don't have to follow those film like the conventional rules, and when it comes to Khata, the experts, the historians and others, they feel like they have something important to say, and they want to say it directly. So in that sense, okay, I was like, I'm not gonna worry about all these conventional rules of like, so I'm just gonna do the thing that is being regarded as kind of the inferior form of making film, and live with that, because it works in this context. That's kind of my argument, right? So, and the making the strange and familiar strange, for me, there's some parts I think it's easy, especially when it comes to there's a lot of prayer katas in lakes, because there's this very common Tibetan ritual practice where you put different like medicines as a way to restore the land. And let's go to their practice. And and nowadays, increasingly, people just put the there inside a kata, just do this and throw it in the lake, toss it in the lake. So you see a lot of that, and the close shots of those. I think it's definitely a kind of an experience of what's the word, defamiliarization, right? And things like that. And then other parts where making kata, the katas. Katas in like Tibetan bars and wedding ceremonies. People are like, oh, we know that. Yeah. So, and I think some of my friends, maybe they were just being nice to me. They say, oh, we did learn some new things. So yeah. So it's not a waste of time. Yeah.
Yeah, I was struck by the diversity of kind of, I don't know, scholarly opinions.
Yes.
On the origins of Khata and the history of Khata.
Oh, yeah.
And really quite a wide range, some emphasizing the pre-Buddhist origins,
Yeah.
others really pinning it to Buddhism in particular.
Yes, yes.
And that you didn't try to kind of harmonize or sort of
yes.
decide on anything or just
Yeah, yeah.
leaving it there. So this kind of decision to allow that multiplicity of voices to just be. What was motivating you to give voice to these different scholars, or to allow that complexity?
Yes, I think different voices is important, and also each person that I interacted with accepted the interview because they think they have something really important to say. They want the world to know this. If you think like that, I'll present it in that way. Right? So for me, I respect that. So I think that part is like, even if it's gonna be critiqued as like, oh, it's one of those rudimentary, like documentary, like talking heads. No, that's okay. It's okay. I can live with that. So in that sense, it's a lot of different views, and then kata, some I would say like broadly shared. Something like I agree with some of the, for example, kata. When you offer this kata to someone, it does something quite amazing. I've written a creative piece about kata, and this already published, and the title is "What if kata could talk?" And kata would say, "You humans are, well, you always say you're smart, and because you have language. But you don't realize that sometimes your language is not as effective as our body. For example, you can offer a kata to your dear root lama, and one kata is just enough. Like no more words, just kata. And then the kata will say, imagine you be saying, dear my root lama, I have my complete faith in you. You are the best lama in the world. Wouldn't that be awkward, right? So I was like, yeah. So in that sense, kata has I agree with the skin bunches is that it does really create this like atmosphere of affection or something there. And once you have that environment, I believe that it can contribute to the ensuing whatever business you're gonna discuss. It reduces the tension or I don't know, but so things like that. I take that quite seriously. Yeah. So, but then of course some of my other Tibetan colleagues you're just making it up. But so it's like that's your interpretation, and I'm fine with that too.
Well, thank you so much for giving voice to the kata here this evening. Really very much appreciate that. And so I think we're out of time actually here. So please join me in thanking Dr. Huatse Gyal for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for giving me a voice to give voice to kata. Thank you.